Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ideas Podcast. Thank you for joining us. With me today is Matt, and we're going to be kind of going back to the roots of the first stuff we did in this channel around getting practical, but perhaps taking a little bit more of a deeper dive than we have in the past. So first things first, Matt, thank you so much for making the time to come and talk to us.
Absolutely, Tom. It was my pleasure. I'm really excited for this discussion.
Awesome, me too. Well, as you know, we masquerade as an L&D podcast, but really, it's all about what are people drinking as they come for a chat. So, what have you got today?
For me, it's just water. It's boring, but I just always have to have a big jug of water. I've steadily gotten large. I've tried to go with those like really big jugs to make it so that I make sure I drink a lot of water. But then I have the little fridge filler, so it takes like a half hour to fill it. So I can't use that anymore.
Now, do you know what? It's funny. I used to work at a water company, and they gave out these water. Well, they called them like personal water bottles, but they were like, you know, the big plastic flasks that you turn upside down on a water cooler in an office. They were like a not particularly miniature version of them. They held about 2.5 liters of water, and I was like, this is fine, but they're quite heavy. And actually drinking from that takes both hands.
That is incredibly awkward.
And if you're not careful, there was no spout, no kind of drinking lid. It was just a big open top. So regularly you would just see people looking a little bit sort of wet. Yeah. You'd be like, I know what you've just done before this meeting.
That's amazing.
So I think smaller bottles sometimes the way to go. I, on the other hand, it is the end of the day in the UK. So I am having a beer that was sent to us by one of our Patreons. Amazing. Thank you very much for what is it? They sent a Southeast PA style Indian Pale Ale.
There are so many.
Thank you very much.
There are so many beers out there. It's so much fun to get to experiment, especially when great supporters send them to you. That's amazing.
Absolutely, yes. So thank you very much for that. You said not to share your name, so I'm not going to, but thank you to you anyway. I appreciate it. So that aside, let's dive in. Let's start with introductions. Tell us a bit about yourself, Matt.
Yeah. So my background, I started in the U.S. military. That's kind of how I started training. I was an instructor pilot for about 10 years. Left the military specifically because I wanted to work at SpaceX, actually. I had no idea how I was going to get there. Okay. But I like to say I jumped out of the plane and hoped I'd find a parachute on the way down. And strangely enough, I got in touch with somebody in charge of one of their launch sites. And they said, well, we need help with training. Do you have any experience with that? And I never in a million years thought my being an instructor pilot is what I was going to take forward with me, but I said yes, of course. I'm sure I can help you out. And then fast forward a couple of years, and I'm down in LA. I was in charge of the training development team for the whole company, and just completely fell in love with all things learning and development. Just this whole world is so amazing and vibrant. I think there's so much potential, so much that we are doing, so much that we can do. So I was at SpaceX for 4 years, left there for another startup for a couple of years, and then fairly recently started my own company, Better Everyday Studios, where we focus on helping companies build custom content for kind of their internal processes for onboarding, explaining product lines, that kind of stuff. I've kind of created the tagline, I think, context is king. When it comes to learning, we're designed to remember things within context, within the context of our surroundings. And so I think that's what we try to help companies do.
Awesome. I mean, that's a cool resume right there, isn't it? Head of training at SpaceX. That's it. That's exciting. Yeah. That really is. So I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit. But I think the main topic for me anyway is we were talking about focusing on the practical side of L&D, and I thought just to get us started. Certainly in my experience, when let's talk about the practical side of things, people don't necessarily understand what I'm talking about. So when you talk about the practical side of L&D, what specifically are you talking about?
So I think there's two different things that come to mind for me. One is just kind of asking the question of like, what are we trying to do here? The question I always start with is, what behavior are you trying to change? And I think this came a lot from, my background as a pilot. It was, I'm literally trying to teach you not to fly into the ground or other things. The end result was so crystal clear that it didn't even need to be discussed, right? It didn't even need to, because it was just apparent. And it wasn't until moving into corporate L&D that I realized like how much you need to pause and think about what are we trying to do here? What is the outcome that what we're trying to achieve, and really focusing on that and distilling that clearly. So that's one part of being practical. And then the other half that really came from my time at SpaceX, Elon has a famous line that he always says is, the best part is no part. And what he means by that is, when you're creating a system, is it should really be as simple as possible, but still achieve the objective. And I think very often, especially with online learning, but this can also happen in live training, we can just get so elaborate, and we want to have fun, and we get into it, and we want to create, elaborate engagements and quizzes. And, I remember taking an online training once that was about fire safety, where, they created this whole interaction where I was like taking my mouse and controlling a fire extinguisher to like try to put out a fire. And it's like, that's neat. And I'm sure the designer had a lot of fun creating it. But practically speaking, like what is it doing, And so I think those are kind of the two levels of like, what are we trying to do here? Really identifying those behavioral objectives, and then getting to it in the simplest, most streamlined way possible, without tons of bells and whistles that are there maybe just show off.
No, I definitely agree with that. I think there is a tendency for that in the L&D world. I think for a long time, maybe the value or the ability of instructional designers and developers has been measured by the snazzy stuff they make, as opposed to the impact they have in a business, which kind of feeds into this pretty heavily. So the flip side of that then, when when you are starting a sort of one of those projects in the corporate space, how do you go about defining those kind of, whether it's deliverables, objectives, behaviors that you want to see change? What does that process look like right at the start?
It really depends on the subject matter expert or the stakeholder that you're working with. I think ideally, I really love the evaluation levels of, where you have like the 4 levels of evaluation, where you start with, was the experience good? And then did they learn anything? Are they behaving any differently? And then what was the outcome? But, flipping that on its head is really effective. And you actually go through the whole thing in reverse, right? Where you start with, what's the business outcome that you're trying to achieve? What's the behavior you need to get to drive that outcome? What learning do you need to drive that behavior? And then what kind of experience do you need to design in order to drive that learning? But I find that though a lot of the conversation really often is around, okay, what's the business outcome that we're trying to achieve? Very often, the people that we're dealing with maybe aren't sure. They're not high enough in the organization, or when they know the outcome that they're trying to achieve, learning is such a small part of it. So it can be hard for them to like clearly distill it sometimes, I think. And so that's where I tend to skip a layer down and just ask the question, what behavior are you trying to change? I spent a lot of time working with environmental health and safety professionals and creating some of those compliance courses. And those, very much like a lot of compliance courses, they tend to be extremely knowledge heavy. They want to talk about regulations. They want to talk about the number of inches off the ground or centimeters off the ground that the railing needs to be, and all those kinds of things. And I find that as they're talking, they've spent a long time creating this long, PowerPoint deck, and you just kind of say, okay, but let's be clear here. What behavior change are you trying to get out of this? What do you want employees to do differently? And that really allows them to focus in, especially in those kind of situations where, they're the compliance person. They're the one out in the workplace seeing what people are doing wrong or what they need more people doing right. And so I find that kind of question really helps focuses it in. When we want business objectives, but sometimes that can be a little bit too big depending on the stakeholder that you're talking to, I have found.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting point, because I think it's great to be looking at the overall business metrics, but I think that acknowledgement that sometimes you may want to do that, but the immediate practicality of who you're working with and what the business is like don't allow for that every time.
Absolutely.
I think often there's a danger, especially when we speak about this stuff outside of the workplace, that everyone's perfect at everything all the time. Right?
Yes.
We're totally all 4 levels in every project.
Absolutely.
They're all 100% effective.
Every company knows their retention metrics perfectly and their safety metrics perfectly. Everyone does.
This is it. And absolutely everything that we've ever made tracks back to a clear business metric. We've never made a bit of content that we would change in any way if we could go back and do it again. But I find that's quite an interesting element in of itself, because do you find that you have a lot of opportunity, or do you bake in opportunity for iteration once you've launched a solution?
Absolutely. I think that's key. And I think that really goes into the second side of practicality as well, is really designing something for it to be iterative. I mean, that was, again, one of the great things about starting my corporate L&D career in SpaceX. Like, SpaceX is iteration. Like, if you look it up in the dictionary, iteration, like, SpaceX is going to be next to it. And I think that's the heart of it. And that's why, I always try to steer clients away and companies away from spending 4 months, 5 months, 6 months creating this big elaborate thing. And if you are going to create a big elaborate thing, having it broken into segments that you can tweak and change. The great thing today is that I think, there's so many tools available to make that so much easier, even with online training. We do a ton of work using Beyond, because sure, maybe it's not going to get you quite the level of customization and fidelity that you're going to get from an Adobe product, but you're going to get it a heck of a lot faster. And it's going to be a whole lot easier to iterate on it if you want to change, So 100%, I think you want to bake into your process of how are we going to make these adjustments, and making sure that in the design process, you're making it easy on yourself later on.
No, definitely. And I mean, what do you tend to find drives that iteration? Because in my experience, that seems to be where the fear lies. Because I've spent a lot of time working in larger corporates that are maybe a little bit scared of, what do you mean we might have to do it 2 or 3 times till we get it absolutely right? Or on the vendor side, where you're selling a product, and so there is an absolute fear of selling something that you then change.
Yeah.
So, when you have iterated on a project, what do you tend to find is the driver for that?
It could be, I think the drive could be from a lot of places. Sometimes, often, honestly, I think if we're being honest, like, often the need for iteration comes from how much rigor got put in at the upfront of, like, thinking through what you needed. You didn't ask as many times what behavior you want to change, or who the learner is, or, so I think in most places, I think if everybody's being honest, the iteration is driven. Some iteration could be stemmed from more rigor at the outset. But then sometimes that's intentional, because you need to launch courses. You need to get them out there, and so then the other side of it is I'm a deep believer in. So Mark Randolph, he was one of the co-founders of Netflix. He was actually the CEO of Netflix, and he has a podcast called That'll Never Work. And he always loved to say, rather than saying there's no bad idea, he says every idea is a bad idea. Like, until you put your product out there, you don't know what people want or need. Everything's just a concept. Everything's just an idea until you actually put it out there. So I think that is the waiting, though you maybe could continue to find fine tune what you create in that version 1 with more upfront work. At some point, you need to cut it off and put it out there, because eventually that's what you're going to need. Once you get it out there, I think the thing that I find most drives iteration is when you put even the subject matter expert, no matter how out in the business they are, there's often a separation between, what in their minds should be happening or what they think is happening and what is actually happening out on the floor. And so you'll start to get some of that feedback from the end learner of, well, it doesn't quite work that way for us, or I know we're supposed to be doing this, but this form is always wrong, or this tool isn't what we use. And so I think continuing to tweak it to make it more and more to the real world and to what's actually happening, that tends to be what I've seen drives a lot of the iteration. And then of course you have, trying to drive more engagement, trying to drive more impact that might, tweak iteration. But I think the thing that I've seen the most is like making it more true to the real world.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because it's not as if it doesn't exist in a lot of other industries. And I spent a lot of time recently speaking to people who work in the product world, where iteration is just a no. You couldn't possibly launch a product without the plan to iterate.
Yes.
I remember, what one chap did turn around to me and said, I think if you launch anything to anyone you don't think you're going to iterate it, you're insane. He said, because someone's going to have something you didn't think about, no matter what. Which I thought was quite an interesting way to look. And he'd been launching products at Apple. And I thought, they'll know their stuff. And he's like, we do so many test launches you wouldn't believe.
Absolutely.
And it's like some of the near misses we have had that would have destroyed the reputation had they gone to full launch.
Yeah.
So that's so interesting.
And I think on that point too, it's one of the hard things about learning development. Out in the rest of the world, you think of product managers, where they're there for the life cycle. They're there for V2, V3, V4. And we have challenges with that external to L&D, like that are imposed upon us in L&D, in that, we can't just keep growing. We can't just keep adding more and more people to be product managers. Let's say you set up, you have people who are in charge of 20 courses or whatever. They're the product manager for these 20 courses or these 5 learning experiences or something. It's hard for us to find the justification for it. It's hard for us to get approval for it sometimes. If we can, that's great. And I think we should constantly try to do that. But I think that then comes back to this idea of being very careful with what we create. If we start from the mindset of everything that we create will have to be iterated, then we can just kind of view everything we create as just this ever-growing backlog of technical debt almost, where there's all of these things that we know we're going to have to get back to. And I think that can help us, that mindset can help us try to keep the catalog of offerings small, and impactful in some ways. I think I always like to say that, those it's easy, especially from an instructional design point of view, it's easy to think, well, I'm an instructional designer. My job is to design instruction. I need to be pushing stuff. But that's not really your job. Everybody's job is to make the organization successful, right? That's everyone's bottom line job. And if we only create stuff that we know will help the organization be successful, there's still a ton to do, right? There's still lots and lots to do. So we're never going to run out of work. But yeah, I think that mindset of realizing we're always going to have to keep coming back to this is one thing that can help us kind of keep those offerings small.
No, I like that. It's sort of like almost entry-level portfolio management in that sense.
Yes.
Because I do feel like when teams really struggle, whenever, and not whenever, a lot of the time when you hear, there's too much work, not enough people, sometimes that is a very real reality, but sometimes it is a created reality. I think you're right, where because L&D wants to solve everything becomes their responsibility, right? And I agree conceptually that L&D is one of the few parts of any business that touches everything.
Yes.
We're in quite a nice position in that way. The flip side of that is you can't do everything.
Yes.
There has to be that acknowledgement of you touch it all, you support it all, but you actually own, I would say, very little of the business.
Yes.
You are more of a servant of many masters as opposed to the owner of everything you survey.
Yes.
So with that in mind, I mean, when you were kind of leading a team, how did you go about instilling that within a team? Because I think that's something I found very challenging, was when you've got very passionate people working for you. They want to do, they want to make everything the moon on a stick. How do you tell them that that's an absolutely great attitude, but you can't do it?
It was actually something that I definitely had to learn. I think early on when I started in corporate L&D, I was that person. It was just like, give me it all. I want to, I want to touch everything. This is so cool. We can do everything. Just make our department the most important department in the whole company, and we'll solve all your problems. Again, going back to getting practical, like nobody's going to take your word for that. I think the key, and this is something that I learned from an amazing leader that I had after I left SpaceX, was, really realizing that every time you're saying yes, you're saying no to other things. The way to get more support, the way to grow your influence is not to promise all the good things that you can do, but actually do things really, really well. And so really focusing on only saying yes to those things that you feel confident you can truly deliver on. Finding a couple key stakeholders, a couple parts of the business. Ideally, you can seek out the parts of the business that are the most influential, that are the highest risk or need the most help. But sometimes it might just be who's ready and willing. There might be a part of the business that you really believe you could help a ton, but their leadership just isn't into it right now. They don't really want to chat with you. If you can find, kind of split the difference between where the most impact can be, who's ready and willing to engage with you, and just run with it as far as you can. I think that's really what we tried to impress. What I tried to think about as I got longer in my career and thought about with my team is like, we need to make sure we're delivering on our promises, because that's what gets us more support. That's what actually has impact, and you can really quickly, if you start to ask yourself, "Am I doing the best I can?" Really quickly, you slow yourself down. There's this great story that I remember hearing once. It was about somebody that worked in the White House, I think. I forget who they were talking about. I forget all the specifics of the story, but the basics of the story is individual had a new job. They were really excited. They were supposed to write some like economic research paper. They did all the write-up, turned it in, and they come back the next day, and it's sitting on their boss's desk with a note on it that just says, "Is this the best you can do?" And so just like, oh my gosh, like, is this? So they go back, rewrite the whole thing, turn it back in. Next day they come back, the same note, "Is this the best you can do?" There's no notes inside of it, just is this the best you can do? After that next rewrite, they come back, "Okay, this is it. I can't think of anything else. This is the best I can do." And their boss says, "Okay, now I'll read it." Right? So like they hadn't even opened it up. So "Is this the best you can do?" wasn't a criticism. It was just asking them to honestly reflect on, is this the best you can do? And so I think for us, rather than running as fast as we can, trying to spit stuff out, just like pause every now and then and be like, is this ready? Is this the best I can do within the constraints that I have? And until you can say yes, maybe don't push it out. And that again, like just it dramatically kind of slows you down, so that you don't just say yes to every hot thing and try to like throw stuff out there all the time.
Do you know, I think that's so interesting, because I think often, rather than asking, is this the best we can do? I think the question becomes, how much can we get done?
Yes.
I think we see that somewhat in the metrics, and it's very popular to make fun of metrics like how many hours of training were delivered and how many bums were on seats and completion. But the simple fact is that I would argue the vast majority of departments probably report on those things, even if they're not willing to admit to it. and that data gets far too much focus, even at kind of C-suite level, because it's what people are used to being presented with.
Yeah.
Because I can say from experience, if you're the L&D person that stands in front of the board and say, I'm going to talk to you about the amount of money that my department has saved your business over the last 12 months, no one is expecting it. Because
Yes.
L&D never talks about money, right? Because we just cost lots. That's what everyone tends to assume.
And I think a similar one unto that, I had a great leader who took that normal metric of, time spent learning and flipped it on its head, where we were rewarded for time saved in learning.
Yeah.
Right? Like spent, because if you can have the amount of time that your company spends doing learning and there is no functional change in the business, that's an amazing win, right? Like you've cut out tons of extraneous information that didn't need to be there, dramatically streamlined everything, simplified the learner experience, made everybody feel like it's more impactful. That is a form of true impact that you can have. And so, yeah, I think you're right. If focusing on how much, rather than focusing on how much time is spent, of how much less time is spent. It's the same metric. We're already measuring it, but just looking at it from a different angle, that in reality, to most companies, like when you present it to them in that way, they're like, oh, wow, this is amazing. Like, look at how much time you're saving us. This is so great.
It's funny. I always had a little bit of a debate with a colleague a couple of weeks ago who was saying it's great that we get X amount of invested time in learning. And I referred to it as shrinkage. Within the business, which is a term they hadn't come across before. But it kind of occurred to me, I don't think a lot of people do think in those terms, that actually that time is not free. The business is paying for every minute of that time. So you better be delivering value for it. Because, you've only got to look at the world we're in now, where I think we've had this massive explosion of let's throw money at learning over the last couple of years, because let's face it, everyone panicked. And just went, make everything e-learning. It'll be fine.
Yes.
Shock, it's not. But hey hum. I think now we're going to see the reverse. I think we're going to see that challenge of, okay, so you've got all this money. Where's the return? Where's the value? Granted, you're not going to make money through L&D. That's highly optimistic, but there should be some value generated for that much input. Yeah. On that note, when it comes to proving the value of something, I feel like this is again where we run the risk of losing our focus on practicality, and we start talking about, I don't know, I call it fluff, but like engagement numbers and happy sheets and how much people love their L&D function, which is all very nice for us to hear. It's a nice ego boost to know that you're beloved amongst your peers, but not particularly relevant, I would argue. So when you get to that stage of a project, what are you looking for? What are you tracking, and what are you looking to be able to present back?
I mean, I think ideally, as is always said, in an ideal world, this is where you start. Right. And ideally, you're starting with the business's own numbers. If you're coming to me with a problem that you want solved, you should be able to quantify that problem and say, like, whether it is, we're currently losing this many people, new hires per month, or what, in the ideal world, you're using the business's numbers. Right. That I think, and you're expecting that you're going to be able to tweak those. But the number one thing that I've always wanted to do that I haven't gotten buy-in yet is, I think we in L&D have such a great opportunity, especially in larger organizations. We should be doing A/B testing of our learning. We should have a metric that we believe we're going to change, send a course to this half of the company, not to this half of the company, and then see what happens. Especially in onboarding, that's easy. Like, you could do that with surveying. So I really, really think we need to get into the A/B testing game more. Kudos to anybody that's doing it. Really impacting those business numbers, I think is really great. As you step back from that, again, no company is perfect. Not everybody has all the numbers. And so sometimes you have to then resort to some form of surveying. In the best case, you're able to ask different parties. You ask the learner, you ask their manager, kind of depends on what your who you're trying to affect and what the situation is that you're trying to change. But I definitely think a big part of that, if there aren't already business numbers out there that you can try to change, I think it's one thing that we need to think about more, definitely need to think about more, is getting baselines before we start. If we're going to have to, if we need to do a survey, if we're going to be responsible for doing some kind of survey, ask some questions beforehand, before the training is launched, so you get a sense of where you are, so that you can then actually see what's changing. If you're doing some kind of culture outreach kind of initiative, and you're asking everybody how much do you believe in the culture, how strong is the culture. If you just say like, hey, we did this culture launch and everybody's at a 9, great. Well, maybe everybody was at a 9.5 before you did the training, and you actually caused it to go in reverse. Again, as we've said, these are all, the reality is these are hard things to do because we're all moving so fast. But it's something we need to try to focus on, is making sure we have some kind of baseline beforehand.
Yeah, it's interesting because I found that getting into that side of things was the first time where I really sort of, I think, got to grips in my career of how important your relationship with other functions that you don't actually necessarily train are. So at the point where I realized I could walk halfway across my local office and there in I don't want to describe it as a dungeon, but there were no windows. So it kind of was. But there sat like the 30 odd members of the business intelligence team for the whole business.
Oh my gosh.
So yes. We just walked in and just went, okay, so I'm moving my desk in here now.
Yes.
Making friends with them and just being a little bit of a, hey, can we tap in? They were so excited that someone wanted their input.
Yes.
And I've found that now, even when we're going to consult for a business and you'll go, so who deals with data? And you'll come, it's this team over here, or it sits over there, or where. There's almost always sometimes it's one person, sometimes it's a big team, kind of depends on the business, but you will find that person or that team is so enthusiastic about anyone that wants their input, because 9 times out of 10, they get ignored, which is a sad fact.
It really is. And I think, to your point, to extend on that a little bit, I would say, like, if you're new to a company, if you're a new learning professional, in my opinion, like, the first person you need to make friends with is walk across within HR, find out whoever owns your HRIS, the HR information system, because that people data is the driver of anything you want to do. Understanding what information you have, what information you don't have, what you can assign things on, or how you can, split up the company. I think that's like the first bit of data that, that people ops team is super important. And then secondly, whether it's the same team or a different team, who has all that data, that business intelligence team, whatever their name may be, because they can sit in lots of places. They can sit in quality, they can sit in IT, maybe they're split up with people ops and somebody somewhere else. Finding those people is so important, because it's really the driver of everything you do. It should be the driver of everything you do.
Absolutely. I think it also it prevents you having to wear yet another hat, because I hear a lot about how now the L&D needs to develop all these skills around data analysis and this kind of thing. I think to an extent, yes, but we already do quite a lot. Like, you speak to the average L&D person, they describe their job and you'd go, well, that's 3 or 4 people's skill sets.
Yes.
Do we really want to add another one? Because good data analysis is not, I'll put it in a spreadsheet and create a pivot table.
VLOOKUP, I got it. VLOOKUP.
Exactly. That's all you need, just Excel. But then when you actually speak to a professional in the area, you realize we're scratching the surface, Yes. I remember in the first meeting, I was like, half an hour, and they went, book half a day. And they spoke to me about how data is pointless. And data analysis is pointless, and data visualization is pointless. The only thing that's useful is the story all of that tells you. And it's that moment going, because they did it in that inevitable kind of, so what does this data say? Oh, well, it says this. No, it doesn't. It says exactly the opposite. What do you mean? Well, let's look at the context of the data. You're like, oh, that completely changes it. Okay, but then let's look at historic data. You're like, oh, and that changes it again. it really kind of was that moment where I just went, yep, this isn't my skill set. This is a professional job. And the way they put it to me was, how would you feel if we came to you and said, the BI team's done a bit of instructional design training, so we're going to produce the e-learning from now on. It's like, okay, yeah, no, that's a fair shout.
That is an amazing experience. And it really, I think it's a challenge or something that can happen kind of in this day and age, because we have so many tools that make it easy to get started. It's like you learn a little bit of Tableau, and you're like, I got this business intelligence thing. It's the same thing with us with a Storyline. You can get started. You can start doing some stuff. It's a really good point.
Yeah. So again, I think it's just it's I hate that kind of work smarter, not harder mentality, because usually it means we're going to pay you nothing, give you no resources, but you're going to have to do the job anyway. I think that if we can look for ways to do it ourselves, if we don't have to do the job and someone else can do it better, and all we need to do is, I don't know, take them a cup of tea occasionally or buy them a donut on a break or something to build a bit of a relationship, it's an easy win for us.
It was a lot of, just to kind of go back to my own evolution, like it was a lot of humble pie that I had to eat. And really, like, when I first started, I'm at this amazing company. I'm new in my role. I'm new in this kind of space. And I was just really so focused on, I got to prove myself. I really got to show my value. And I think that insecurity is what drives a lot of people to want to take on so much more. And I think with L&D often being, it's like HR is already like kind of the subset of a broader company. And then L&D is often like the subset of HR, and we're like over here and nobody wants to play with us. And so like that can drive a lot of insecurities that make us want to like go and do all this stuff. And if you can just kind of swallow that and be like, no, like that's not what it's about. I'm comfortable where I am. I'm comfortable with what I do and what I can achieve. And that then kind of opens you up to try to go forge those partnerships and work with other people rather than trying to like tell other people what to do.
No, definitely. I definitely agree with that. So I know we're kind of rapidly speeding towards the last kind of 15 minutes or so of the episode.
Yeah.
I really want to touch on something that I ask most people on the show, and that is around the industry as a whole right now. When you look out, what are you sort of really excited about? What do you look at and think, yes, I want to see more of this? And is there anything that falls on the opposite side that concerns you a little bit in the industry that we have today?
I think definitely what a lot of people are talking about is, the drive to bring us closer to the business and to drive true business results. I think that's a big movement. I think I'm really excited about it. Connected with that, that would almost be on the other side of I'm not sure of, or I'm kind of worried about, is the whole kind of the skills discussion that is often is sometimes in L&D, sometimes it's a little bit outside. It's definitely a bigger picture. But I think when you're talking about being practical, or when you're talking about driving practical things in the business, driving business results, well, what do you need to do to drive that? Okay, well, we're going to be upskilling people, reskilling people, and so then that's how you quickly get to discussion of these skills. And currently, it feels like at least I can't get my head around these like big, like 100,000 skill catalogs that are starting to like be the solution. It's like, oh, you just like plug in AI and you plug in your people data and you plug in all these hundreds of thousands of skills, and like that's how we're going to tell you what to do. I feel like there's still a rather than just letting the machine like break you apart into a bunch of little pieces, I feel like there's more work that people can do to deliberately define bigger picture kind of like capabilities or competencies. I think Josh Bersin uses the term capabilities, and that I really like. That's kind of meant to be that next level up of, if skills are the things that you do, capabilities are like, what are you meant to do? Yeah. And I think spending more time at that higher layer rather than the base layer, because we're never going to be able to define all the skills, and we're never going to be able to define all the ways that people get those skills. Yeah. And so I think kind of taking a step up from that and just like letting that kind of go is something that's gonna come eventually.
Yeah, it's interesting because I often think back to when I kind of really got started, and one of the biggest things that was, it's challenging, it's big, but it's vital, was competency frameworking. And developing that for every role in your business. And as an L&D function, that was your foundational piece. If you didn't have that, you were lost. I see that less now, but to me, that is kind of exactly, as you say, that should be sitting over and guiding all this conversation around skills. And I tend to find that those conversations that create a framework help with those weird skills as well. Because I always look at my own company and think, if I wrote a list of skills that all my people must have, loads of the skills that are amazingly useful wouldn't be on it, because I would never have known to put them on the list.
Exactly.
And I suspect that if I said, this person's, I don't know, a learning solutions architect, let's pick a nice modern job title that no one quite understands what it means. Let's throw that out there, put that in front of an AI, and it goes, okay, so you need the following skills. Based on what? Even if it pulls in the danger is that it does pull in everything from everywhere. And because everyone has their own definition of every job title now, there's very little standardization. You're never really going to know what your people are getting. I think it's interesting. It might work. I could be wrong, but I think I would share your, maybe not concern, but just lack of
trepidation.
Yes, this is it. I'm to be convinced. Let's put it that way.
And it's a delicate balance, because it's all hard. Everything's changing so fast. Businesses are changing so fast. In some ways, it comes back to the product manager discussion that we talked about earlier. Is like, is there somebody whose job is to stay on top of this and monitor these capabilities and monitor what we're doing as a company and how we're organized? I think we have gotten used. We like to create final solutions, and the world just doesn't really fit that anymore, and things are always going to be evolving. And how do we shift the way we think about it?
No, I think that's it's going to be an interesting couple of years ahead on that basis alone, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's fantastic. Thank you so much again for making the time to come and chat. If people want to get in touch or continue the conversation, where's the best place to get hold of you?
I'm super active on LinkedIn, so definitely look me up there. Matthew Gjertsen. It's a weird last name, I know. If you type in GJ, you'll start to get there. You'll always start to get there. But Matthew Gjertsen. Also, beteverydaystudios.com is our website, so we have a blog there. If you want to reach out there, please feel free. I love, as you can tell, I love talking about this stuff. I think the industry is infinitely amazing. There's so many different directions that things are going. It's really exciting. And I as much as I look forward to the things that I think are going to happen, I'm almost more excited to all the things of like, how am I going to get proved wrong? How am I, is crypto going to end up, or blockchain going to end up being critical to everything we do? Or our skills, as you're saying, is AI and skills going to solve it all? And we're going to, have all these new tools. It's a fun future to see.
Absolutely. And we will include links to Matt's LinkedIn and website in the description of this episode. All that remains is for me to say thank you once again to Matt, and to you, our audience. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Ideas Podcast. Please do share in the comments what you're walking away from this conversation with. What are you thinking about? What might you change about what you're doing? And if you've got any questions, just let us know.